I'm Johannes Bauer. I'm the director of the Quello Center at Michigan State University, a research and outreach center focusing on issues of media and information policy. It's my pleasure today to welcome you to this talk on cyber insurance policy. But to introduce our speaker, I would like to turn over to Rick Warsh. Rick is an associate professor in the Department of Media and Information in our college, the College of Communication Arts and Sciences. And with Emily Rader, who is also present, he's one of the driving forces behind the Bit Lab in our college. And I'll turn it over to you, Rick, to introduce Josephine.
All right, welcome everyone, and welcome Josephine to this talk. Josephine, she's currently an associate professor at Tufts University. She was previously at Rochester Institute of Technology, and also been a fellow at a number of places like Berkman Klein and New America. She's done a lot of really interesting work around cybersecurity writ large, both as a scholar. And one of the interesting things about Josephine is that she also writes for a lot of the mainstream media. I've read a lot of her work in places like Slate, the New York Times, and The Atlantic, which is great. I think I really like the way that she bridges the scholarly and mainstream media worlds. She has a book recently, You'll See This Message When It's Too Late, the legal and economic aftermath of cybersecurity breaches, that I particularly like. Actually, it's the one required book for my cybersecurity course next semester. It's a really great book that actually goes through a number of specific cybersecurity incidents and talks through what happened in those incidents, and then draws really interesting policy recommendations from this series of case studies across a wide variety of different types of incidents. And so she's a very interesting scholar who thinks about things at a wide variety of different levels. And I'm very anxious to hear her talk on cyber insurance policy. So Josephine, please.
Thank you so much, Rick, Johannes, all of you for coming. I'm so excited to be here. I'm giving this talk for the first time. It's about my new book, which will come out next year on cyber insurance. And it sort of picks up, in my mind at least, where that book that Rick was just describing so generously leaves off. And my sort of great obsession or fascination, depending on how you frame it, is what happens after cybersecurity incidents, how people respond to them, who has to pay for them, who gets blamed for them, what lessons are drawn for them. And so I did this first book project that came out in 2018 that was really sort of trying to trace who sues whom and how do those lawsuits resolve and who are we holding responsible or liable. And one of the things that came out of that project was this sense that more and more of the companies and the individuals I talked to, including policymakers, including people who are thinking about how do we sort of need to rethink these liability regimes, more and more of what I was hearing was, well, this is really something that insurance is going to solve for us. The insurers are going to come in and they're going to kind of lay down the framework for who has to do what and who's going to pay for it if things go wrong. And so I got sort of increasingly interested in trying to understand what this insurance market looked like. And at the moment when I started looking at it in 2016, 2017, I would say it was really sort of one of the moments when people have been most excited about cyber insurance and really felt like it's really exploding. The premiums are shooting up 30-35% every year. Everybody's going to be buying it. And since then, we've seen perhaps a little bit of a sort of counter narrative there, in which, especially with the rise of ransomware that I'm going to talk a little bit about today, there's more of a sense of, oh, you know, are the insurers really going to be able to continue covering these types of risks? Is this an insurable type of risk? Whatever we mean by that, and what does the future of this cyber insurance market look like? So I've been working for a few years on this project, and I'm going to sort of talk about a little piece of it today, but I wanted to frame the broader project for you first. And the things that really interest me, the progression of this project starts with going to legal documents, which is one of the sources that I use most often because I find in the aftermath of these really messy cybersecurity incidents, one of the places where you get kind of the most detail and the most sort of explicit narratives about what's happened and what went wrong are in these court proceedings. And this time, instead of looking at the legal proceedings between all of the different sort of victims and stakeholders in a cybersecurity incident, I was really focused on the disputes between insurers and their policyholders over cybersecurity incidents. And there's actually, a fairly rich history of those. There are a lot of claims that get filed under non-cyber policies that then get denied. So you have people who, so for instance, Sony has a big breach 7 years ago now, and files a claim under its commercial general liability insurance and says, you should help us pay for the lawsuit that resulted from this breach because this is general liability coverage. And there's this long legal dispute between Sony and its insurer Zurich, and we're going to come back to that insurer again, about, is this even covered given that it's a cyber incident and this was never an insurance policy written to cover cyber incidents. And so the first kind of chunk of the book is about the history of cyber insurance, how this market emerges, and laying that history out alongside this series of legal disputes in which insurers are pretty explicitly carving this out of a lot of their other coverage, saying, all of these other policies that you have around property and casualty, around commercial general liability, around commercial crime are not going to cover the things that are related to cyber, are related to computers. And you actually sort of start seeing this trend where insurers are explicitly excluding computer-related stuff from a lot of their standard policies. And then as that's happening, they're also realizing there's this demand for coverage of these cyber-related incidents. And so you start seeing the growth of these specific cyber insurance policies in which they're saying, don't buy this commercial general liability insurance if you're worried about data breaches. For that, you have to go buy our special data breach insurance or our standalone kind of all-encompassing cyber insurance. So one of the questions I'm really interested in is how are the courts sort of thinking about cyber risks in the context of all of the existing lines of insurance? What is it that allows for the insurers to kind of carve these risks out of the existing coverage that they offer and create this new market for cyber insurance? And I'm especially interested in it as a sort of way of thinking about how are we isolating cyber risks from all of the other kinds of risks that they're so clearly enmeshed with, right? We don't think of, or I don't think of cyber risk as something necessarily totally distinct from commercial liability, from crime, from property and casualty damage. And so part of this process and sort of part of understanding the history of this industry, I think, is trying to wrap our heads around why the courts go along with that framing for as long as they do. And as I'm going to talk about today, this is still sort of very much an active area of litigation. So there are a lot of cases still ongoing, one of which I'm going to talk about in some detail today, that really are still trying to sort out what do these cyber insurance policies mean? Who's actually responsible for covering the costs here? And part of what I'm trying to argue in this book is that there's still really a need for a lot more clarity from courts, from lawmakers, from policymakers about what the sort of legal and liability responsibilities are going to be in this space. Because even though we now have a lot of these cyber-specific insurance policies, there's still tremendous ambiguity in a lot of how they're being applied and a lot of how sort of the claims are being dealt with. So that's one theme I'm really interested in, is sort of that interplay between the courts, the claims being filed with insurers, and the ways that cyber risks are being understood as different or similar to other types of risks that are covered by insurance. Another thing I'm really interested in, because one of the things I care a lot about is sort of how do you improve cybersecurity, is whether this trend in cyber insurance is actually improving cybersecurity. And what I mean by that is, does it actually lead to more security controls, better security controls, fewer incidents, less damage resulting from those incidents in organizations that are experiencing cybersecurity breaches? Right? If you buy cyber insurance, is part of that insurance process going to actually involve improving your security posture? And I would say sort of right now, the argument I make is that mostly cyber insurance has not done that for any industry. It has not strengthened the security posture. And what a lot of insurers would say, and have said when I talk to them, is, well, it's still really early, right? We're still sort of figuring out what our policyholders have to do in order to strengthen their cybersecurity. And eventually we're going to get to the point where we can say, here's the equivalent of requiring seatbelts and airbags for cars. Here's what we would need to do to make sort of comparable safety and security requirements for people around cybersecurity. And another argument in the book, and I'm not going to talk as much about this today, but I'm happy to come back to it during Q&A if folks are interested, is that we really aren't seeing progress in that direction. And there are a lot of different reasons for that. One reason for that is a lot of the times the insurers themselves don't get any insight into the incidents they cover because of client attorney privilege, kind of guarding all of the information about the incident so it can't be shared with the insurer. Another reason for that is that a lot of that work of sort of trying to figure out what happened when something goes wrong or how a company needs to protect itself better is being outsourced to security firms that partner with the insurer and is not necessarily making its way back to the insurer to be combined with the claims data and used to analyze what sorts of controls those companies should be using. So that's another interest of mine, is sort of this question of, is there any governance role for cyber insurance? Can it actually be used to reduce risk? Or is it just sort of there so that when you suffer a big breach, somebody else is helping you cover the costs? Which to my mind is a less effective or a less useful way of trying to grow a cyber insurance industry than one that can actually help us reduce risk. And both of these questions and sort of the whole project itself, I would say, is fundamentally about trying to conceptualize how is cyber risk different from other types of risks, or is it different from other types of risks in terms of its insurability, right? Does it actually present new challenges, or are we instead looking at a set of risks that would always have taken a few years or maybe even a few decades to be able to insure and to collect the data we need, but we will eventually get to a point where we can treat it in the way that we treat auto risk or property and casualty risk or flood risk or anything else that has sort of a clear insurance industry around it that continues to be not necessarily profitable in the case of flood risk, but at least sort of stable. And because I'm a policy person, part of that for me is trying to understand what are the things that policymakers would have to do in order to help kind of stabilize this industry, but also turn it into an industry that is having a positive cybersecurity impact, that is driving down risk, that is making companies more secure, rather than just an industry that is capitalizing on the fact that there are a lot of companies really worried about cyber risk right now who are willing to pay money in order to feel some confidence that they won't be on the hook for the costs of those breaches. So those are sort of the larger themes around the book. It starts with a chapter thinking about the history of cyber insurance. The history of cyber insurance in most tellings, including mine, starts with this guy, who's a man named Steve Haas, who's contracting for AIG back in the 90s. And he launches through AIG the first internet security liability insurance policy in 1997 at a party at a big insurance conference called the Breach on the Beach Party. And I think to understand what the past 2+ decades of cyber insurance have looked like, and the way that progression has in many ways been really guided by the cybersecurity policy landscape, it's kind of interesting to go back to that first policy and understand what some of the numbers looked like then. So this first ISL plan offered coverage of up to $250,000 just in legal costs and settlement fees for any lawsuits resulting from payment card theft. So if you're thinking about sort of what are the risks that companies are worried about in the 1990s from a cybersecurity standpoint, what kinds of companies are worried about these, it's a pretty narrow focus on retailers who are collecting payment card information and worried that there may be breaches that result in lawsuits, right? That's kind of the first motivation for selling these types of insurance policies. And it's going to be spurred in part by the fact that a whole bunch of states are going to start passing data breach notification laws, beginning with California in the early 2000s, and then snowballing to all of the others over the next decade and a half. And as more states are requiring companies to report payment card breaches or any kinds of personal data breaches like these, then there's going to be a greater risk of lawsuits resulting from them, because all of a sudden all the victims are going to find out that their information was stolen. And once you start worrying about lawsuits, you have a reason to maybe go out and buy a new kind of insurance that will help protect you from some of those legal costs. So that's what the internet security liability insurance that first goes on the market in 1997 is supposed to do. The premium for the plan, if you're interested in sort of some of the pricing stuff, started at $2,500 annually. One of the things people are really interested in right now, watching the rise of ransomware, is how quickly the premiums for cyber insurance policies are increasing. And we think on the whole that that's because these prices kind of came out of nowhere, right? There wasn't a strong sense of how much cybersecurity incidents were going to cost, how frequently they were going to occur. So a lot of the pricing has been really based on the size of the company you're insuring, or some very general sense of what we think the profit margins for cyber insurance are, rather than being linked to really strong actuarial science about here's how much this set of risks is going to cost us next year. Here's how much we need to take in premiums to be able to cover all of the claims that we anticipate. And then there's also this piece, which interests me a lot in terms of how insurers think about vetting or auditing their policyholders' security status, which is that if you had an audit performed by the National Computer Security Association, you could qualify for a 25% discount and bring down those premium costs to a little under $2,000 a year. And I bring that up because when I talk about this question of sort of whether or not we think insurance makes us any more secure, a big piece of that comes back to sort of looking very closely at what are the processes that insurers use to say, do you have good security or not? And this is a fairly standard one in which you kind of outsource that to some third party and say, if they sign off on your security posture, then that's good enough for us, right? A lot of insurers don't want to build up a huge amount of in-house cybersecurity expertise. But the thing I think is interesting here is in 1997, you get a 25% discount for doing that audit. Now you get no discount, right? Now there is, I would say on the whole, so little confidence in the value of those assessments that they affect the premium pricing almost not at all, right? There's still sort of this questionnaire usually that you have to fill out about, do you have firewalls? Do you have an incident response plan and so on? But it's very much a sort of, I would say, a compliance check more than it is a in-depth assessment of how good is your security, or even what does your security posture look like in any meaningful way. And the story that sort of the project I've done covers is really kind of from this moment in 1997, when you're starting to see the emergence of these data breach insurance policies that are really focused on covering what we call third-party costs. Right, so this is a policy that's interested in, are there costs that are being imposed by the sort of third-party victims whose data has been stolen in this case, that are then kind of coming back in the form of lawsuits? Those would be the kinds of costs you'd be most worried about in the 1990s and the early 2000s. As we get to like 2012, 2013, there's going to be much more interesting coverage for first-party costs. And first-party costs are going to be everything that sort of directly affecting the organization that holds the insurance policy. So if you're paying a ransom, that's a first party cost. If you have to replace all of your software and your hardware, that's a first party cost. If you lost 2 days worth of business because you had to shut down all of your systems and reboot them, that's again going to be sort of these direct costs rather than the third party ones brought by these second order victims. And so the shift that we're going to see over the span of that 20 or so year period is going to be much more expansion of the first party costs over time, much more emphasis on things like coverage that will make ransom payments, or coverage that will provide for lost business during an outage, whether that's due to a technical error or an attack or something else. We're going to see much less of a sort of financial benefit to engaging with any of the security assessments, because there's not going to turn out to be a lot of empirical evidence that those drive down risk, right? If you send people out to be assessed by whichever firm, then there's not clearly going to be a link between having done that assessment and having better outcomes or fewer security incidents. And so I would say on the whole, insurers are going to trust those assessments less and less. They're going to be much less willing to link prices and premiums to those assessments. And they're going to become much more of a sort of rote process that the insurers and the policyholders both set very little store by. We see sort of this growth that people get very excited about. I mentioned when I was starting this project about 4 years ago, right? People were feeling like, oh my gosh, the cyber insurance market is exploding. It's growing so fast. One thing I would say is, just sort of for context, the cyber insurance market is a tiny, tiny, tiny piece of the overall insurance market. So if we think about something like personal auto insurance, that's about $200 billion a year in premiums. Just in the United States. If we think about something like cyber insurance, that's now probably close to $6 billion a year in annual premiums. So it's a tiny market, but the reason that people care about it, and not just me, but say insurers and people in that industry are interested in it, was the sense that it was the opportunity for growth for a lot of insurers, that even though it was small right now, there was going to be increasing demand for it. And that a lot of other kind of big insurance sectors are pretty static, are kind of where they've been for many years, and not a lot of opportunity to grow them much more widely. Whereas the cyber insurance market seemed like something that was really shooting up. I would say if you look at this graph, which is showing you the direct written premiums between 2016 and 2019, that growth has slowed a fair bit in the past couple of years. I think there are a lot of reasons for that. One is just that the premiums have really increased dramatically, and a lot of firms have had to drop their cyber insurance policies. Another is that there's been a lot of uncertainty that I'm going to talk a little more about around what these policies actually cover. And so companies are perhaps a little more wary than they used to be of spending a lot of money on coverage when it's not clear that that coverage is actually going to work for them in the situations where they might most need it. But there is this excitement in the insurance industry around sort of the idea that this is going to be the next big thing, that if you don't get on board, you're going to get left behind, and all of your competitors are going to sort of snatch up all of the cyber insurance customers. And then one of the things that lends itself to, that I think is kind of interesting and perhaps also a little troubling, is a sense that you just have to sort of start selling these policies and then figure out the math later on. Right, so there's this real rush in a lot of cases for companies to start up a cyber insurance practice, to start selling this product, and kind of do it on the assumption that if you can claim some set of customers early on when they're first deciding who am I going to buy my cyber insurance from, then later on you'll collect the data and you'll figure out how it should be priced and what kinds of safeguards you should require from policyholders and everything else. And for the moment, all you're trying to do is kind of lock in your market share. And I think you see some of that happening kind of in the 2017, 2018 moment, where insurers are just really worried about being left behind. And not all of them. Some of them decide this is too risky a business, there's too little data, we can't get into it. But many of them are sort of really focused on the idea that this could be where the future of the insurance market is going. And importantly, at that moment, right, again, I'm talking 2 to 3 years ago, not right now, it's a really profitable line, right? It's not by any means, as I've said, the biggest share of what insurers are doing, but it's much more profitable for each dollar in premium being paid. And so that as well sort of adds to the sense of, even though we don't necessarily know everything we might want to know about how frequently these incidents occur, we're not losing money on this, right? There doesn't seem like a huge amount of risk in selling these policies and selling more and more of them. This is a report from the New York Times in 2019 saying the loss ratio for US cyber policies was about 35% in 2018. So for every dollar in premiums collected from policyholders, insurers paid out roughly 35% in claims. By contrast, for property and casualty insurance, they're paying out about 62 cents in claims per premium dollar. So not just the sense that this is growing rapidly, that there's sort of more room for growth in this sector than most other insurance sectors, but also that it's a lucrative business to be in, that the uncertainty around how to price it has led to insurers maybe overpricing it a little more than they otherwise would, because other companies don't necessarily know what the right price to set is. And one of the things I would say about this particular article or this particular statistic is I think it will give you a little bit of a sense of how much insurers are kind of pinning their pricing to what all of their competitors are doing in this market, right? They're not setting up their own quantitative models and saying, here's how much we think we need to charge based on all of these statistics, because they don't have access to good statistics about cybersecurity incidents. Instead, they're saying, okay, if that's what everybody else is charging, I guess we should charge that too. And because of that, they're sort of not driving down the profit margins in competition with each other. That's going to change, I should say, sort of before we get some of the historical analogs there. You're going to see with the rise of ransomware in 2019, 2020, a really sort of deep cut into those profit margins. And that's also when the premiums are going to start increasing pretty quickly and pretty dramatically in ways that are going to drive some customers out of this market. So I'm interested in kind of understanding that history. I'm also interested in sort of trying to put this alongside other types of risk and think a little bit about where are we in the evolution of this insurance market as compared to other insurance markets. So I talk a little bit in the book about sort of the auto insurance market, how long it takes for that to emerge. One of the things that I sort of come away with strongly from looking at the history of insurance is that this is often a slow process, right? So if we think of the car as a kind of analogous new technology that comes on the scene, creates new risks, requires the establishment of a completely new insurance industry, you sort of trace from when the first auto insurance policy is sold in 1898 to when the first mandates are going to be passed, right? Auto insurance is something that's required in a lot of places. If you want to operate a vehicle, that's going to come 20 years later. And then sort of the rethinking of that insurance setup and liability is going to come another 50 years after that in the 70s, when people start thinking about no-fault insurance. And no-fault insurance, which is this idea that emerges largely around auto claims, is this idea that you want to be able to resolve claims really quickly, and you want to be able to resolve them without having to make any definitive determinations about who's at fault. So you're not going to sort of go through the long legal case about was this driver right or wrong. You're instead going to have a kind of automatic payment policy in order to deal with the large number of vehicle accidents that are being handled, and in order to make sure that kind of the priority is victim compensation rather than the sometimes very lengthy, sometimes very expensive legal process. There's a report that comes out in 1932 from a committee that's put together to study car accidents and the role of insurance. And I think one of the things that I'm sort of always interested in here is the extent to which the ways that people are talking about other new areas of insurance resonate with how people now talk about cyber insurance. So I've put this quote from that 1932 report up because I think it's an interesting one to think about in light of cybersecurity incidents. They write, because of the great number of cases involved and the peculiar difficulties of handling them under the existing system, the problem of dealing with motor vehicle accidents deserves separate consideration. They're saying separate from the ways that we think about compensation for other types of accidents, for other kinds of injury or damage under insurance. In motor vehicle accident cases, the principle of negligence is peculiarly difficult to apply. In most automobile accidents, a car collides with another car or with a pedestrian. All the action occurs within a few seconds. It is almost impossible for witnesses, even though they have not been participants in the accident, to remember and to reproduce exactly to the jury swiftly succeeding events which they have been neither trained nor prepared to observe. And I sort of bring out this quote because I think there's a lot that resonates with me when we look at the history of auto insurance and think about the emergence of cyber insurance, one of which is great number of cases, right? This is a sort of a high volume activity. You get a lot of car accidents, you get a lot of cybersecurity incidents. One of them is this idea that sort of the liability piece is difficult, right? It's not impossible, just as it's not impossible to say who's at fault for a car accident, but things are happening quickly. The people involved don't necessarily have a ton of relevant expertise to be able to understand or untangle all of the different things at play. And so I think there's sort of interesting parallels here. On the other hand, the recommendation that comes out of this report that goes into effect for, I'd say, about a decade in the United States and for longer in other places is this idea of no-fault insurance, where we just say, like, forget liability, forget who's at fault, let's just pay out claims to the victims. And I think that also sort of gets some really swift and significant pushback in the auto insurance space, and is not something that is always widely being used now, in most states at least. And so there's also, I think, this interesting narrative in insurance history in which people try to rethink liability, people try to rethink how do we make this a more functional process depending on your priority. And in this case, the priority at the time was compensate victims, don't tie up the court system with hundreds and hundreds of car accident cases. I think you could imagine sort of similar priorities around cybersecurity incidents, but you could also imagine very different ones. You could also imagine saying the priority is figuring out what we need to do to secure networks and data better, rather than sort of compensating everybody and moving on as quickly as possible. I also talk a little bit about flood insurance, which I think is another really interesting historical analog. It's a kind of insurance that requires an enormous amount of regulatory intervention because it's really unprofitable, right? The only people who want to buy flood insurance are the people who live in places where there's a very high risk of floods. And so there's no way to really kind of balance out the claims that are being made by those people with premiums being paid by folks who aren't at high risk of flood. And because of that, there's basically a sort of total collapse of the private industry offerings in flood insurance in the 1920s. So there is a market for private flood insurance in late 1800s, early 1900s. Then you get a really sort of massive set of floods from the Mississippi River. And all of the private insurers basically decide this is a terrible business. We should not be sort of trying to pay out these claims. You have some sort of comparisons there that I think are relevant for thinking about cybersecurity incidents. And the big one that comes up is this idea of interconnected risk. So one of the things you worry about with floods is if one home floods in, along the coast of the Mississippi River, then all of them are, right? There's the interconnection of all of the risk across all of those different policyholders. Unlike, say, if you're insuring car accidents. Right, if I get in a car accident, that probably doesn't mean that everybody else who shares my insurance is also getting into a car accident that day. With a flood, you're looking at, really, really large scale damage that's going to affect a lot of your customers all at once if you're an insurer. Similar idea with cybersecurity, right? That one incident can have an interconnected impact on lots and lots of different customers. And perhaps even scarier than floods is the sense that you won't be able to predict who's going to be interconnected in these incidents, right? At least with the flood, you can say, okay, there's going to be some geographic co-location of the people who are affected. They're all going to be, in these floodplain regions or whatnot. With cybersecurity, you can say, okay, well, maybe everybody who uses the Windows operating system is going to be affected, but that's almost everybody. And so you haven't really sort of come up with a way to diversify your customer base and their risk profiles very effectively. The other thing I want to say about flood insurance, right, involves the government underwriting all of flood insurance, starting in the 1960s with the passage of the National Flood Insurance Act, which is going to lead to the NFIP, the National Flood Insurance Program. But the thing I think is most relevant for sort of thinking about cyber insurance here is that government-led program only exists after years and years of really extensive government-run data collection efforts. So you get the Army Corps of Engineers releasing guidelines for reducing flood damages. They do an assessment of flood-prone communities in the United States. The Geological Survey releases a 19-volume study on the frequency and size of floods. The Water Resources Council issues a report on standards for assessing flood risk. And again, I think if we're sort of talking about what are the missing pieces for a robust cyber insurance market right now, there's also a lot of interest and a lot of emphasis on what would it take to collect useful data, right? It would be helpful to have perhaps a 19-volume study on the frequency and cost of cybersecurity incidents. It would be helpful to have some more standard metrics for assessing cyber risk. All of these are things where I think you see sort of potential roles for policymakers and government entities, and roles that they've played in the past for other types of insurance. So I want to take the last chunk of time before we shift to questions to talk about one of the very specific cases that I look at in the book and kind of come back to this ransomware issue that I teased in the title, which I think is one of the sort of most interesting and controversial pieces of thinking about cyber insurance right now. And I want to talk about NotPetya, which is a cyber attack many of you have probably read about. It starts with a Ukrainian energy company sort of noticing that something's wrong with its computers, that it's not able to bring up its systems in the ways that it should be. It spirals very quickly and since the summer of 2017 to affect a number of companies worldwide. The Maersk shipping company is affected, has a very large number of losses from interruptions to its business. It files a claim with its insurer to cover those losses. It gets denied that claim. And all over the world, you have companies sort of hit by the same piece of kind of ransomware, not exactly ransomware. It's a program that looks a lot like ransomware when it first emerges. Very heavily concentrated number of victims in Ukraine. We now know because there's a Ukrainian accounting software that's being used as the initial vector to spread this malware, but also all over Europe and even in countries outside of Europe. You're seeing computer systems being shut down in enormous numbers in ways that sort of really dramatically interfere with the operations of businesses across a bunch of different sectors. And again, thinking about interconnected risk, right? If you're an insurer, one of the ways you've been sort of telling yourself you have a diverse risk pool in your cyber insurance customer base is by saying, okay, we've got, some folks in food and some folks in healthcare and some folks in retail and some folks in shipping. And one of the things NotPetya makes really clear is that that's not a way to diversify your risk pool, right? That all of those different sectors can be simultaneously affected by one cyber attack, which was not necessarily a surprise, or certainly not a surprise to people who'd been studying malware and cybersecurity for a while, but a really sort of poignant reminder to insurers that the tools that they have for diversifying risk in other areas don't necessarily apply to this type of risk. What NotPetya does is it shuts down your computer systems, it encrypts and then deletes all of the contents of your hard drives. It does show a message that suggests that it wants a ransom, right? This is the, send $300 worth of Bitcoin to the following address. It doesn't actually work. You can't actually pay the ransoms. One of the things that comes out as this is happening at the time is when people try to actually contact the people who they're supposed to use to ask about the ransom payment, turns out those are not real email addresses. So there's definitely a sense early on, this is not just a kind of standard financially motivated ransomware attack. And there's then, not immediately, but in the not too distant future, a year later, a very coordinated attempt to attribute this to the Russian government. So this is the announcement from the National Cybersecurity Center in the UK. They put out this announcement in February of 2018 that the Russian military was almost certainly responsible for NotPetya. The White House is going to put out a statement a week later about the Russian military being behind NotPetya. A bunch of other countries are also going to make sort of formal attribution statements in this week-long span, and it's an interesting kind of strategy for attribution, I would say, somewhat unlike anything we've seen before in terms of trying to kind of take certainty from the coordinated effort of all of these different governments and say, this is a really kind of confident attribution that we have 10 different countries behind. And agreeing with. And it's important for thinking about the insurance piece, because one of the things that's going to happen in the aftermath of this incident is that these companies, Maersk, the shipping company is one, another one is Mondelez, this multinational food company, are going to file claims to cover the costs of their losses. And they're going to be told, no, that's not a covered claim because what happened was a warlike action. What happened was actually excluded from your cyber insurance policy. And part of the rationale the insurers are going to give for that is going to be about the idea that the Russian government is behind this attack. So having all of these formal statements that say this was the Russian government is actually going to be sort of useful for the insurers here to be able to say, see, this was a military, this was a nation state, this was war. The Mondelez property insurance policy explicitly covers all risks of physical loss or damage to electronic data, programs, or software, including physical loss or damage caused by the malicious introduction of a machine code or instruction. So pretty sort of explicitly lays out, here is the coverage for malware. This is something that Mondelez has actually sort of purchased extra as part of its property and casualty insurance for exactly the reason that I talked about before, that a lot of these types of cyber risks have been explicitly excluded from standard property and casualty coverages. And they've really thought at the time, we've bought something that's going to cover any kind of business interruption from malware, covers any period of interruption directly resulting from the failure of the insured's electronic data processing equipment or media to operate, resulting from malicious cyber damage. So the language in this insurance policy, I would say, is pretty explicit in applying to situations like this one. On the other hand, there's also going to be this exclusion that the insurer, Zurich, brings up. I would say in general, right, I mentioned Zurich in the context of the Sony case from 2014. Zurich is one of the more litigious of the cyber insurers. They're more eager to kind of go to battle and say, we won't cover this. This should be excluded. I mean, that's what they do here. They say, no, this isn't included because there's this exclusion carved out of your policy that says we don't cover any damage resulting from hostile or warlike action in time of peace or war, any sort of attack that's perpetrated by a government or sovereign power, by a military, naval, or air force, or agent or authority of any party specified in those previous 2 points. So the attribution statement saying this was the Russian government, this was the Russian military, hugely helpful to Zurich right here to be able to say, look, this was clearly an attack by a government or sovereign power or military. That then goes to court. Zurich and Mondelez, along with Maersk and their insurer, are sort of still in the process of fighting out this dispute over whether or not this is an act of war. I just want to wrap up in the final few minutes by talking a little bit about sort of the historical precedent when we're thinking about, is this an act of war or not, right? There are all sorts of fights over what's cyber war. There are also all sorts of historical fights over, well, what's war in the insurance context? So after the sinking of the Lusitania, you have a dispute between the Vanderbilt family and the life insurer Travelers that covered one of the Vanderbilt members who was aboard the Lusitania. And they go to court and they say, was the sinking of the Lusitania an act of war? And the court says, yeah, okay, this was a sinking by a sovereign government. This was something that was sort of done by a military during a period of war being waged between Great Britain and Germany. Even if there hasn't been a formal declaration of war, this is something that we would consider in the insurance context, just sort of in the context of whether or not this life insurance policy applies, an act of war. And you get a similar set of cases after Pearl Harbor, because Pearl Harbor happens technically the day before the United States declares war. So there are a bunch of life insurance cases that are people's families saying we should receive payment from this person's life insurance, and the life insurer saying, no, they died in an act of war. Pearl Harbor was an act of war and that's excluded. Those cases lead to some really different kind of interpretations by different courts of what is war. So for instance, there's a New York life insurance case around a guy named Stankus who says, look, war is everything that sort of looks like war. The term war is not limited, restricted, or modified by anything appearing in the insurance policy. It refers to no particular type or kind of war, but applies in general to every situation that ordinary people would commonly regard as war. So you have sort of one legal interpretation that is everything that looks like war is war. And then you also have some really, really narrow interpretations in the courts. This is another Pearl Harbor case, a dispute between the family of a guy named Rosenau and his life insurer, Idaho Mutual, that says, look, we are concerned with the meaning and intent of the word as contained in a formal legal contract of insurance. It seems quite obvious that words and phrases in a contract of this nature are intended to be used in the legal sense. Right, so war doesn't start until Congress officially legally declares it. So this is a sort of set of case law that leaves a lot of ambiguity around what war may or may not mean. There are some other cases that I talk a little bit about in the book, the hijacking of Pan Am Flight 93, right, in this dispute over, well, is this war or is this terrorism? There's an exclusion in Pan Am's Aetna coverage that covers not just war and civil war, but also riots, civil commotion. Pan Am's going to go to court with Aetna over denying this claim, and the court's going to say, no, this wasn't war, right? This was, the war is only something that is waged by governments, and the terrorist organization involved here was not a government. There's going to be a similar case in the 70s about damage done to a Holiday Inn hotel during the civil war in Lebanon, in which Holiday Inn is going to file a claim with its insurer, and its insurer is going to deny that claim and say this was an act of war. And again, there's going to be this sort of sense from the courts of this was not war, right? This was a lot of competing factions. This was sort of, the country came close to anarchy, but the constitutional government existed throughout. So the point I want to make by sort of touching on some of these historical cases is that on the whole, courts have been pretty reluctant to say this is an act of war. that's not covered by insurance. And we'll see if that continues to be the case with NotPetya. What NotPetya has that's different from these cases, I would say, is a really clear sense that there's a government behind it. And so to the extent that that's being defined in the Zurich policy as the definition of war, it's possible Zurich has more of a case there. The other thing I just want to touch on here, right, here's Andy Greenberg saying the release of NotPetya was an act of cyber war by almost any definition, is that after this dispute begins between Mondelez and NotPetya, there's then going to be a scramble by the insurers to rewrite their policies and make clearer what is and is not included, because a lot of people look at this case and say, well, I don't want to buy cyber insurance if it's not going to cover any of the big cyber attacks that are launched by, say, the Russian government. And so you get this really interesting rewriting. Here's a more recent version of the Zurich cyber insurance template policy, in which they're still excluding war, warlike action, insurrection, rebellion, revolution, riot, but they're also going to explicitly include what they call cyber terrorism. And this is how they define cyber terrorism. So it's the use of information technology with any intention to cause harm, intimidate any person or entity, cause destruction to critical infrastructure or data. And they're going to say explicitly that this includes activity by any person or group, whether acting alone or on behalf of or in connection with any individual, organization, or government. So they're going to put governments right in there, and they're going to have what I think are these very contradictory exclusions and inclusions, in which they say acts of war are excluded, cyber terrorism is included, and they're saying this in order to sort of appease customers who are worried that big cyber attacks won't be covered, but they're defining cyber terrorism and cyber war along very different criteria. So the war definitions are going to be all about sort of who's behind this attack, or was it a government? Whereas the terrorism definitions are going to be all about what kinds of impacts are there, right? If you look at this terrorism definition, was there any harm caused? Was there any intimidation intended? Was there any destruction or harm to critical infrastructure or data? Those are sort of totally orthogonal to my mind ways of defining this. I think the terrorism definition is a more productive one for thinking about cyber attacks, just based on sort of what we can know about them quickly, how it allows us to sort of sidestep some of the attribution disputes, how it could potentially allow for disaggregation of different victims. So that instead of saying, you know, all of NotPetya is war, all of NotPetya isn't war, you can say, well, maybe certain targets where there's a really clear political motivation that could be considered war, and that might be excluded. But for other victims, for other types of damage, perhaps we should think about it more generally. All right, I want to wrap up because I haven't saved as much time for questions as I wish. I'll just end by sort of touching on the question of insurers actually paying ransoms directly, which does not happen in the NotPetya case because the ransoms can't actually be paid, but does happen in a number of other cases. This is a story about one of the cities in Florida that decides they're going to pay a ransom of almost $500,000, but they themselves are only on the hook for the $10,000 deductible in their insurance policy. And one of the other sort of recent and growing controversies in this space has been the ways in which insurers are viewed as sort of directly underwriting criminal enterprise by making these ransom payments on behalf of their customers. It's a policy problem because it contributes to the growing threat of ransomware. It's also a really sort of pressing financial problem for the insurers because they have not priced their policies to allow them to be able to make the scale and the number of payments that they are now being asked to make by their policyholders. And so both of those, I think, are contributing to a sense that the coverage for ransoms is in the process of and will continue to contract considerably. And there again, I would argue there's some role for policymakers in thinking about what they would like insurers to be doing in this space and what positive role those insurers could play. Takeaways for policymakers, I would say there are some standard asks that insurers make of policymakers, and they're usually, we need a lot more data and the government should collect it, and we need a government backstop. So if there's a really devastating cyber attack, the government will pay for it. I think there are some other problems that I would perhaps prefer to see policymakers tackle, or would see perhaps more progress in having policymakers tackle around clarifying what these policies do and don't cover, what cyber war looks like in these situations, whether we need government coverage to fill the gaps presented by those war exclusions, which is something that we have in other situations, and whether we need to think about sort of trying to prevent the routinization of these ransom payments by insurers. I'm going to stop there. And I'm going to stop sharing my slides as well because I would love to take some questions.